The sun beat down relentlessly on the asphalt, turning the movie set into a giant oven. It was a kind of heat that made the air shimmer and dance, distorting the horizon. For most people, this was a day to stay inside under the cool hum of an air conditioner. But for Keanu, this was just another Tuesday. He stood near the center of the chaos, dressed in a heavy, tactical jacket that felt like a second skin, though it was anything but comfortable. Around him, the crew moved with the frantic energy of an army. Cameras rolled on heavy tracks. People shouted into headsets, and the scent of hot dust and expensive coffee hung in the still air. To everyone watching, Keanu looked exactly as they expected him to look. He was a figure of strength, the man who didn't age, the action star who could outrun explosions and take down bad guys twice his size. He stood with his hands on his hips, nodding as the director explained the next sequence. It was a complicated stunt. It involved running down a narrow alley, vaulting over a concrete barrier, and landing in a roll that transitioned into a sprint. It was the kind of thing that would make a younger athlete think twice. But Keanu just listened. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for a break. He simply looked at the path he had to take and memorized the cracks in the pavement. When the director called action, the shift in him was immediate. The tiredness that seemed to hang in his shoulders vanished, replaced by a focused, intense energy. He took off running. His boots hit the ground with a heavy rhythm that the microphones picked up perfectly. He reached the barrier and launched himself into the air. For a split second, he was flying, suspended against the bright blue sky. Then he hit the ground. The roll was smooth, practiced, and perfect. He came up running, his face a mask of determination, and hit his mark exactly where he was supposed to. Cut. That was perfect. The director's voice crackled over the loudspeakers. Let's reset for camera B. The crew burst into motion again, resetting the scene. Keanu walked back to his starting point, accepting a bottle of water from a nearby assistant. He took a small sip, offering a grateful nod and a soft smile. That smile was famous. It was the one that made people feel like he was just a regular guy, a humble friend you hadn't seen in a while. But if someone had looked really closely, past the charm and the familiarity, they might have seen something else. They might have seen the way his hand trembled ever so slightly as he handed the bottle back. They might have noticed the deep, dark circles under his eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide, or the way his breathing remained just a little too fast, long after the run was over. This wasn't just the fatigue of a long day. This was something much heavier. Keanu had spent decades carrying a rucksack full of invisible stones. The world knew the public story of his losses, the tragedies that had struck his family like lightning. But the world didn't know the daily reality of it. They didn't know how quiet got inside his mind when the cameras stopped rolling. Every stunt he performed, every punch he threw on screen wasn't just acting. It was a way to keep moving. He had long ago decided that if he stopped moving, the weight of his grief might finally crush him. So he kept running. He kept fighting. He became the immortal hero for everyone else because he couldn't be the fragile human for himself. As the day wore on, the sun began its slow descent, casting long, stretching shadows across the set. The temperature dropped slightly, but the humidity clung to everything. They were filming the night scenes now, which meant giant, blinding lights were being set up to mimic the brightness of day. Keanu stood by a prop car, waiting for the lighting adjustment. He felt a strange sensation in his chest. It wasn't pain exactly, but more like a hollow vibration. His heart felt like it was skipping beats, then racing to catch up, thudding against his ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to center himself. He tried to visualize his breath moving in and out, a technique he had used for years during martial arts training. But the image wouldn't hold. Instead, he felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. The ground beneath his feet felt unstable, as if he were standing on a boat in choppy water. He reached out and placed his hand on the cool metal of the car to steady himself. The metal was warm from the lights, but solid. "Hey, you okay there?" a voice asked. It was the stunt coordinator, a sturdy man with kind eyes who had worked with Keanu for years. Keanu opened his eyes and forced the mask back into place. He stood up straight, letting go of the car. "Yeah," he said, his voice raspy but steady. "Just a little lightheaded. Need some more water, probably." The coordinator looked at him for a beat, searching his face. "We can push the next shot back if you need 10 minutes," he offered gently. Keanu shook his head immediately. "No, let's keep going. The light is right. I'm good." He couldn't stop. Stopping felt like admitting defeat. It felt like letting the darkness in. So he pushed it down. He buried the dizziness and the erratic heartbeat under layers of discipline. He walked back to the mark. The scene called for him to sprint across the street, slide over the hood of a moving car, and land on his feet. It was dangerous. It required absolute precision. The atmosphere on the set tensed. Everyone knew this was the big shot of the day. The director called for quiet. The hum of the generators seemed to get louder in the silence. Action. Keanu ran. He pushed off with everything he had. His legs felt heavy, like lead weights, but he willed them to move faster. He saw the car approaching, timed his steps, and jumped. He hit the hood, his hips sliding across the painted surface. But this time, something was wrong. As he transitioned to slide off the side, his body didn't respond the way it should have. His momentum was off. Instead of landing on his feet and absorbing the shock, he crumpled. He hit the pavement hard. The air left his lungs in a sharp whoosh. For a second, he just lay there, staring up at the blinding studio lights. They looked like stars, burning hot and white. He couldn't hear the shouts of the crew rushing toward him. He couldn't hear the director yelling cut. All he could hear was a high-pitched ringing in his ears and the sound of his own heart struggling to find a rhythm. He wasn't hurt badly by the fall, at least not in a way that was visible. There was no broken bone, no gushing blood, but as he tried to push himself up, his arms gave way. He tried to tell the people swarming around him that he was fine, that he could stand up, but his voice wouldn't work. The words were just breath in his throat. He felt a hand on his shoulder, gentle but firm. "Don't move," someone said. "Just take a second." Keanu squeezed his eyes shut. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was the one who caught the other people when they fell. He was the one who saved the day. Lying on the hard ground, feeling the vibrations that set through his spine, he felt a cold spear of fear pierce his chest. This wasn't just exhaustion. This was a collapse from the inside out. With the help of 2 medics, he managed to sit up. The world spun violently. He put his head between his knees, focusing on the gritty texture of the asphalt, trying to anchor himself. The medics were asking him questions. What year it was, what his name was, if he felt pain anywhere. He answered them correctly, his voice flat, disconnecting his mind from his body. He told them he was just tired. He told them he probably twisted his ankle. But inside, he knew the truth was much scarier. The silence he had been carrying, the grief he had been swallowing for 30 years, had turned into a physical thing. It had wrapped itself around his spine and squeezed the life out of him. He wasn't just tired. He was empty. He insisted on walking to his trailer. He wouldn't let them carry him. He put one foot in front of the other, walking slowly, surrounded by worried faces. He kept his eyes on the ground, ashamed of his weakness, terrified that everyone could see the cracks in his armor. When he finally reached his trailer, he climbed the steps with the difficulty of an old man. He paused at the entrance, looking back at the set. The crew was watching him, a hush fallen over the usually noisy lot. He offered a small, weak wave, a reflex to comfort them, and then stepped inside. The latch clicked shut, sealing the cool, dim quiet. He leaned back against the wall, sliding down until he sat on the floor. He didn't turn on the lights. He just sat there in the semi-darkness, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, and finally let the mask slip off his face. For the first time in years, Keanu didn't try to be strong. He just sat there, hands shaking his lap, and felt the terrifying reality that his body was telling him it was time to stop fighting. The drive back to his home was quiet, but not the kind of quiet Keanu usually enjoyed. He sat in the back seat of the car, watching the city lights blur past the window. Normally, the hum of the engine and the motion of the street soothed him. It was a time to decompress, to let the character he was playing fall away until only the man remained. But tonight, the man felt fractured. He pressed his palm flat against his chest, feeling the erratic rhythm of his heart. It was beating too fast, then skipping a beat, then thudding heavily against his ribs like a trapped bird desperate to escape. When the car pulled up to his private residence, the driver stepped out to open the door. But Keanu waved him off. He forced a smile, tight and tired, and assured the driver he was fine. He didn't want help. He didn't want anyone to see him struggle to walk the short distance to the entrance. He waited until the car drove away, the taillights fading into the distance, before he turned and faced the front of his house. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the structure. It was a place of sanctuary, a place where he could hide from the world and be himself. But tonight, the walls looked taller, the shadows longer. The silence that usually greeted him felt heavy, almost oppressive. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. It glided smoothly on its track, a modern and silent entry, devoid of the old, heavy barriers of the past. He stepped inside and locked the world out. The house was dark, save for the ambient light coming from the kitchen. He dropped his keys on a side table, the clatter sounding like a gunshot in the silence. He didn't bother turning on any lights. He just wanted to sit. He walked toward the living area, his movements sluggish. Every step required a conscious effort, a command from his brain to his legs to lift and move. He felt like he was walking through deep water, the air thick and resistant. He reached the sofa and collapsed onto it. The leather was cool against his skin, but it didn't offer the relief he craved. He leaned his head back, closing his eyes, hoping the dizziness would pass. He told himself it was just the heat. It was just the long hours. It was just a bad day. If he slept for 8 hours, he would be okay. He would wake up and be the man everyone expected him to be. Strong, capable, unbreakable. But as the minutes ticked by, the feeling in his chest changed from a flutter to a heavy pressure. It felt like a hand was squeezing him, tighter and tighter. He opened his eyes and looked around the room. The familiar shapes of his furniture looked alien in the dark. He thought about getting a glass of water. His body demanded hydration, but the thought of standing up again made him nauseous. He tried to take a deep breath, but his lungs wouldn't expand fully. The air felt thin. This was the unraveling. It wasn't a dramatic event that happened all at once. It was a slow, steady tearing apart of the fabric of his life. He looked at the photos on the shelf across the room. In the dim light, he could just make out the faces of people he had loved and lost. For years, he had carried their memories with him like a quiet comfort, a reason to keep going even when life was hard. But now, in the suffocating stillness of the room, those memories felt heavy. They felt like stones in his pockets, pulling him down. He realized he had been grieving for decades, hiding it behind a polite smile and a relentless work ethic. He had never really stopped to mourn, never really let himself break. Now, it seemed his body was doing the breaking for him. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot down his left arm. It wasn't a muscle cramp from the stunt. It was different, deeper and colder. He gasped, clutching his arm. Fear, cold and primal, spiked in his gut. He knew what this was. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew his own body, and he knew when something was terribly wrong. He tried to stand to get to his phone, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. The room began to spin violently. The floor tilted up to meet him. He slid off the sofa and onto the plush rug. He hit the ground with a thud, but he barely registered the impact. He was on his hands and knees, breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. The pain in his chest radiated to his jaw, sharp and biting. He felt sweat break out across his forehead, cold and clammy. He was alone, truly alone. The irony of it washed over him. A man known to millions, surrounded by people on set every day, yet lying helpless on his living room floor with no one to hear him. He crawled toward the coffee table where he had left his cell phone. It was only a few feet away, but it felt like miles. His vision blurred, dark spots dancing at the edges. He gritted his teeth, forcing his trembling muscles to move. "Come on," he whispered to himself, his voice a harsh rasp in the quiet room. "Just a little more." His fingers brushed the edge of the table. He reached up, his hand shaking violently, and knocked the phone off. It clattered onto the hard floor, sliding just out of reach. He stared at it, a wave of despair crashing over him. He was so tired. The urge to just close his eyes and let go was strong. The struggle felt too big, the weight of his past and his present too heavy to carry anymore. But deep down, a flicker of fight remained. It wasn't about the movies or the fame. It was a simple, stubborn refusal to give up. He stretched out his arm, straining every muscle and grasped the phone. He pulled it close, fumbling with the screen. His vision was swimming, making the numbers blur. He managed to swipe the screen open and dialed the one number he had memorized for emergencies, his private physician. It rang once, twice. A voice answered, calm and professional. "Hello." Keanu tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He made a sound, a pained grunt that conveyed everything words couldn't. "Keanu? Is that you?" "What's wrong?" The voice asked, urgency creeping in. He took a breath, forcing air into his lungs. "Help," he choked out. It was barely a whisper. "Chest, can't breathe. I'm calling an ambulance." "Stay on the line with me," the doctor said. Keanu let the phone drop from his hand, but stayed close to it, listening to the voice on the other end. It anchored him to reality, kept him from drifting away into the darkness. He curled up on his side on the floor, drawing his knees up. The pain was constant now, a crushing weight that made him want to scream. But he didn't have the energy. He just lay there, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the ticking of a clock somewhere, and the voice in his ear telling him to hold on. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Time lost its meaning in the haze of pain. Then he heard it, the faint wail of a siren in the distance. It grew louder, cutting through the quiet neighborhood. Red and blue lights began to flash through the windows, painting the room in strobing colors. He watched the light play across the ceiling, feeling strangely detached. Then came the pounding on the front door. "Paramedics. Open up." Keanu couldn't move. He couldn't get up to unlock the door. He hoped they would find a way in. He heard the sound of the lock being manipulated from the outside, security features that allowed emergency access. The door slid open and a flood of noise rushed in. Heavy boots thudded across the floor. Flashlights cut through the gloom, landing on him. "We found him. Over here." Suddenly, he was surrounded by people. Strangers in uniforms were touching him, talking to him, asking him questions. They shone a light in his eyes, took his pulse, attached sticky pads to his chest. He felt small and fragile beneath their hands. He looked up at their faces, masked and serious, and for a moment, he felt like a child again. "We're going to help you, sir. Just relax," one of them said. "We need to get you to the hospital." They lifted him onto a stretcher with practiced ease. As they wheeled him out of the house, he looked around at his living room one last time. It looked the same as it always had, but he knew he was leaving it behind as a different person than when he arrived. The mask was gone. The invincible action star was gone. There was only Keanu, the man, broken and afraid, being carried out into the night. The air outside was cool as they loaded him into the back of the ambulance. The doors closed, shutting out the world. He stared up at the metal ceiling of the vehicle, listening to the frantic beeping of the monitors that were now tracking his failing heart. The siren wailed again, a mournful sound that matched the cry of his own soul. He closed his eyes, finally surrendering control to the strangers fighting to keep him alive. The silent battle he had fought for so long was over, and the war for his life had just begun. The transition from the noisy, chaotic ambulance to the quiet, sterile room felt like moving between two different worlds. The beeping of the monitors followed him, a relentless reminder that his body was no longer functioning on its own. When the heavy motion of the vehicle stopped and the doors opened, the air that rushed in was cool and smelled of disinfectant. It was a smell that signaled sickness, a place where people fought to survive, and it was jarring for a man used to the smell of gunpowder, gasoline, and movie-set dust. He was transferred to a bed with wheels and rolled through bright, white hallways. Faces passed by, nurses, orderlies, other patients, but they were all a blur to him. He kept his eyes fixed on the ceiling tiles, counting them to keep his mind off the pain radiating through his chest. Finally, they turned into a private room. It was spacious, as his status afforded him certain privileges, but it felt just as much like a cage as any other room in the building. The staff lifted him gently onto the hospital bed, connected the lines from the monitors to machines on the wall, and left him alone with the soft hum of medical equipment. For a long time, Keanu just lay there. He was stripped of his leather jacket, his boots, and the armor of his movie character. He wore only a thin, flimsy gown that tied in the back. He felt exposed, not just physically, but spiritually. Without the props of his job, who was he? He wasn't the action hero here. He was just a man in a bed, attached to wires that measured the fragile beating of his heart. A doctor came in later, an older man with kind eyes and a grave expression. He didn't speak in the quick, hurried tone of the emergency room staff. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. He explained that this wasn't just a simple collapse. The test showed a total system failure, a result of decades of extreme physical stress compounded by a profound, unaddressed emotional weight. Your body has been running on adrenaline for so long that it forgot how to rest, the doctor said softly, checking the charts at the foot of the bed. You have pushed this machine past its limits. The grief you carry, it manifests physically, Mr. Reeves. You cannot carry a mountain on your back and expect your heart not to feel the pressure. Keanu listened in silence. He stared at a blank television screen mounted on the wall across from him. He wanted to argue, to say he was fine, that he just needed a few days of sleep. But deep down, he knew the doctor was right. He felt the truth of it in the deep ache of his bones. He had spent so many years being strong for everyone else, absorbing the shocks of life so others wouldn't have to, that he had shattered the foundation he stood on. The doctor left, prescribing rest and a battery of more tests for the following days. The room settled back into silence. This was the sterile white exile the outline had promised. It wasn't just about being away from home. It was about being away from life. The glass window next to his bed looked out over the city skyline. He could see the sun moving across the sky, marking the passage of time. He watched the day turn into evening, the city lights flickering on like distant stars. People down there were eating dinner, walking their dogs, laughing, living. He was separate from it all, floating in a bubble of sickness and stillness. This isolation was absolute. He had instructed his team to keep his condition private, which meant only a handful of people even knew where he was. His phone had been taken away, a necessary step to force him to disconnect. For a man who was constantly surrounded by people, the silence was deafening. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was an aggressive, demanding silence that forced him to look inward. In the quiet of the night, when the nurses only came in to check his vitals every few hours, the ghosts began to arrive. They didn't appear as spooky figures, but as memories so sharp they felt like physical blows. He thought of his daughter, taken before she really had a chance to live. He thought of his partner, the love of his life, gone in an instant. He thought of his best friend, a brother in spirit, lost to time and tragedy. He had spent years running from these memories, using the grueling schedule of filming to drown them out. When he was on a motorcycle at 100 miles an hour or learning complex fight choreography, his brain was too busy to grieve. But here, lying flat on his back, he couldn't run. The memories washed over him. The laughter, the pain, the overwhelming sense of unfairness. He realized he had never truly allowed himself to mourn. He had packed it all away in a box and sat on it, thinking if he ignored it, it would go away. But grief doesn't vanish. It grows if it is not fed with tears and time. A tear rolled down the side of his face and into his ear, cold and wet. He didn't wipe it away. He let it fall. Then another came, and another. He lay in the dark, his chest heaving not just from the physical strain, but from the release of emotions he had suppressed for 30 years. He cried for the little girl he never got to watch grow up. He cried for the woman he would never hold again. He cried for the friend he could no longer call. The heartbreak he felt wasn't just about the past. It was about the realization of his own fragility. He had always thought he was the one who could endure anything, the rock for everyone else. Now, staring at the ceiling, he understood that he was human. He was breakable. The invincible savior he played on screen was a fiction. The reality was a man in a hospital gown, fighting to breathe, scared that he had damaged himself beyond repair. Days bled into one another. The routine became his new world. Waking up for blood work, eating bland food, staring out the window, sleeping fitfully. He lost track of time. Was it Tuesday? Friday? It didn't matter. The world outside continued without him. Movies would be made, suns would rise and set, and he was just a spectator. The only thing that marked his existence was a slow, agonizing process of his body trying to heal itself. One afternoon, a nurse came in to change the forebag. She was young, with a gentle touch and a quiet demeanor. She didn't treat him like a celebrity. She treated him like a sick man who needed care. As she adjusted the tubing, she looked at his face and noticed a redness around his eyes, the evidence of his private weeping. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't ask for an autograph or a photo. She simply patted his hand, a small gesture of compassion that broke through his walls. "It's okay to rest," she said softly. "The world will still be there when you wake up." He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a human being offering kindness without wanting anything in return. He squeezed her hand weakly, a silent thank you. It was the first connection he had felt since arriving. It reminded him that beneath the grief and the physical collapse, there was still a part of him that could connect with others, a part that wasn't completely destroyed. As she left the room, sliding the glass partition shut with a soft click, Keanu turned his gaze back to the window. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the city. He took a deep breath, wincing slightly as his ribs protested. He was miles away from the life he knew, stranded in this sterile white room. But as the darkness of the evening crept in, he knew he couldn't stay here forever. He realized that this collapse, as terrifying as it was also a chance. It was a forced stop, a cosmic intervention telling him that he couldn't live the rest of his life as a ghost haunting his own existence. He closed his eyes, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. It was slower now, more steady. He was still broken, still scared, and still deeply sad. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't running. He was lying still, feeling the weight of everything, and knowing that the only way out was to go through it. The fight for his life wasn't just about healing his heart. It was about learning how to live with it, even if it was scarred forever. The move from the hospital room to the rehabilitation wing was short, but it felt like crossing a border into a different country. The beeping machines and the constant vigilance of the ICU were replaced by the quieter, more persistent hum of physical therapy. This was not a place for dying. It was a place for the slow, frustrating work of trying to live again. Keanu was wheeled into a large, bright room filled with mats, parallel bars, and strange-looking equipment designed to stretch and strengthen. The sun was streaming through the windows, bouncing off the polished floor, and the light felt harsh compared to the dim cave of his hospital room. His therapist for the day was a young man named Ben, who had the kind of optimism that usually annoyed Keanu. Ben was upbeat, energetic, and spoke in a constant stream of encouragement. "All right, let's get you moving," Ben said cheerfully, locking the wheels of the wheelchair. "Today we start small, just standing up and holding onto the bars." Keanu looked at the parallel bars gleaming in the sunlight. They were only a few feet away. A week ago, he would have jogged them without a second thought. Now, they looked like a mountain range. He gripped the arms of his wheelchair. His knuckles turned white. He took a deep breath, pushing down the sudden wave of panic that rose in his throat. He pushed himself up. His legs trembled violently. They felt like they were made of lead, completely disconnected from his brain's commands. He wobbled, his center of gravity shifting dangerously. Ben was there instantly, a steady hand on Keanu's back, not doing work for him, but simply ensuring he didn't fall. "You got this," Ben said. "Just find your balance." Keanu gritted his teeth. Sweat beaded on his forehead instantly. This was the unglamorous reality of recovery. There was no background music, no editing to cut out the pain, just the sound of his own ragged breathing and the embarrassing, uncontrollable shaking of his own muscles. He managed to stay upright for 10 seconds, maybe 20, before his knees gave way. He collapsed back into the wheelchair, his chest heaving, exhausted by a task a toddler could perform. "Good job," Ben said, marking something on a clipboard. "That's a start." Keanu wiped his face with the back of his hand. He felt a flash of anger, hot and irrational. He wasn't angry at Ben, but at himself. He was angry at the weakness, at the betrayal of his own body. For years, his body had been his tool, his instrument. It had always done what he asked, no matter how extreme the demand. Now, it was a stranger to him. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that held guns and threw punches in movies, now trembling as he reached for a cup of water. Over the next few days, the routine set in. Mornings were for basic mobility, trying to stand, trying to lift his legs. Afternoons were for exercises that seemed insultingly simple. squeezing a rubber ball, lifting a 1-pound weight, stretching bands. Each movement was a battle. The pain wasn't sharp like injury. It was a deep, aching soreness that settled into his bones and refused to leave. One afternoon, the frustration boiled over. They were working on arm strength. Ben asked Keanu to raise his arm above his head. Keanu tried. He commanded his arm to move, but it stopped halfway, shaking violently before dropping back to his lap. He tried again, and again. It wouldn't go any higher. The room suddenly felt very hot. Keanu stared at his useless arm. The silence of the gym, filled only with the squeak of rubber shoes and the clinking of weights, pressed in on him. He felt a lump form in his throat, thick and hard. He thought of the action scenes he had filmed, the impossible feats he had pulled off. Who was he now? He wasn't the hero. He wasn't the tough guy. He was a man who couldn't lift his own arm. The tears came before he could stop them. They didn't flow gently. They just spilled over, hot and humiliating. He put his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. He didn't make a sound, but his body was racked with sobs. It was the sound of a man breaking, the sound of grief finally finding an exit. He cried for his lost strength, for the time he had wasted, and for the crushing realization that he might never be the same again. Ben didn't say anything at first. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell him it would be okay. He just stood there, giving him space, a silent guardian. After a few minutes, Ben pulled a chair over and sat down in front of Keanu. He didn't look at him with pity, which Keanu appreciated. He just looked at him like a human being. You know, Ben said quietly, my dad had a stroke last year. He was a carpenter, built houses with his hands for 40 years. When he came here, he couldn't hold a hammer. He cried just like you are now. Keanu looked up, his vision blurry. He wiped his eyes, embarrassed but listening. He hated it. Ben continued. He felt like half a man. But one day, he realized that the fight wasn't about the hammer. It was about holding his granddaughter's hand. He relearned everything for that. Not for the job, for the life. The words hung in the air between them. Keanu thought about his own life. He had spent so much time doing, performing, achieving. He had defined himself by what he could do, how fast he could run, how hard he could hit. He had never defined himself by just being. He looked at Ben, really seeing him for the first time, not as a therapist, but as a person with his own story, his own struggles. Is he okay? Keanu asked, his voice raspy. Ben smiled. Yeah, he's back building birdhouses. Not big buildings, just small things. But he's happy. Something shifted inside Keanu. The pressure in his chest loosened, just a fraction. He realized that he had been fighting to get back to a movie set, to be the action star again. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was just learning to be Keanu again, the man underneath the leather jacket. From that day on, the dynamic changed. Keanu stopped looking at the exercises as punishments and started seeing them as a path back to humanity. He began to talk to the staff. He asked a woman at the front desk about her children. He listened to the night nurse talk about her nursing school classes. He shared his own stories, making them laugh with self-deprecating jokes about his clumsiness. He found that by connecting with them, by stepping out of his own bubble of misery, the heavy weight of his grief became lighter. It was still there, always would be, but it wasn't crushing him anymore. A week later, Ben suggested a new challenge. Let's try the hallway, he said. No wheelchair, just you and me. The hallway was long and polished, stretching out into the distance. To Keanu, it looked like a marathon. He stood up, gripping the handrail that ran along the wall. His heart was hammering, not from failure this time, but from anticipation. Just one step at a time, Ben said, walking close behind him. I've got you. Keanu lifted his right foot. He placed it down. Then the left. The muscles in his thighs screamed in protest, but he ignored them. He focused on the feeling of the floor beneath his feet, the cool, solid surface. He was grounding himself in the present moment, feeling the texture of his own life returning to him. Step by step, he moved down the hall. It was agonizingly slow. He had to stop every few feet to catch his breath. Sweat dripped off his nose. But he didn't stop moving. He wasn't running from explosions. He wasn't fighting bad guys. He was just walking, and it was the hardest thing he had ever done. Halfway down the hall, he paused. He looked out a window to the side. He saw a tree outside, its leaves rustling in the wind. It was a simple, ordinary thing, but standing there, trembling with effort, he found it beautiful. He felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. He realized that he didn't need to be invincible to be worthy. He just needed to keep going. "You're doing it," Ben said softly. Keanu nodded. He took a deep breath and took another step. He didn't cheer or shout. He just smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He was fighting, yes, but he wasn't fighting the world anymore. He was fighting for himself. And for the first time in a long time, he thought he might actually win. The morning of his discharge arrived with clarity that the past few weeks had lacked. There were no blinding studio lights, no shouting directors, and no frantic alarms. Just the soft, natural light of the sun creeping across the floor of his room. Keanu dressed slowly. He wasn't putting on a costume or a tactical suit. He pulled on a soft, well-worn sweater and a pair of comfortable loose-fitting pants. These were clothes that allowed him to just be. When he looked in the small mirror above the sink, he saw a face that was older than the one he remembered. His skin was a bit paler, his hair grayer at the temples, and his eyes held a depth that hadn't been there before. He didn't look like the immortal action hero. He looked like a man who had stared into the abyss and walked away. He walked out of the facility without a wheelchair. He carried his own small bag, slung over one shoulder. The sliding glass doors opened smoothly, and for the first time in weeks, he wasn't looking out through a window. He was actually standing in it. The air was crisp and cool, filling his lungs in a way that the recycled hospital air never could. It smelled of the city, exhaust fumes, coffee, and the distance and the ocean. To anyone else, it might have smelled like pollution, but to Keanu, it smelled like life. He got into the back seat of the waiting car. The driver looked back, surprised to see him sitting upright without a nurse by his side, but simply smiled and wished him a good day. As the car merged onto the highway, Keanu rolled the window down just an inch. He wanted to hear the noise of the world, the whoosh of the wind, the honk of a horn, the thump of the tires over the pavement. These were the sounds of a planet that kept spinning even when he was forced to stop. It was a comforting realization. He wasn't essential to the turning of the earth, and that was okay. It took the pressure off. When they pulled up to his home, the house looked the same, yet completely different. It was no longer a fortress where he hid from his grief. It was just a house, a place with walls and a roof. He stepped inside, the silence greeting him like an old friend. But this time, the silence didn't feel heavy or oppressive. It felt neutral. He walked through the living room, his eyes falling on the spot where he had fallen. He could still remember the terror of that night, the feeling of his heart failing him. He stood there for a moment, acknowledging the memory, but then he took a deep breath and let it go. The fear was gone. In its place was a profound sense of gratitude that he was still here to see the rug, the furniture, and the light streaming through the glass. He didn't rush to unpack. He didn't check his emails or call his agent. Instead, he went to the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator and took out a bottle of cold water. The simple act of opening the bottle and lifting it to his lips felt like a small victory. He drank it all, feeling the coldness spread through him. He sat on a stool at the counter, looking out the window at the trees swaying in the breeze. He realized that for years he had been addicted to motion. If he stopped moving, the sadness would catch up. Now, he understood that the sadness was just a passenger. It didn't have to drive the car. A few days later, Keanu decided to leave the house. He didn't take a motorcycle. He didn't have a bodyguard. He just walked out the front door and down the street. He moved slowly. There was no urgency in his step. His gait was different now, less aggressive, more deliberate. He found himself at a small park a few blocks away. It was a weekday afternoon, so it was mostly quiet. A few mothers were watching their children play, and an old man was feeding pigeons on a bench. Keanu found an empty bench and sat down. He leaned back, stretching his legs out. He watched a dog chasing a tennis ball, its tail wagging with pure, unadulterated joy. He watched a little girl struggling to tie her shoelace, her face scrunched up in concentration. These were the scenes he usually raced past in a car or ignored while reading a script. Now they were fascinating. He realized that the fight he had been through wasn't about getting back to a movie set. It was about getting back to this. The right to sit on a bench and watch the world exist without needing to save it. He closed his eyes and let the sun warm his face. He thought about the people he had lost. He thought about his daughter and his partner in the past. Thinking of them brought a sharp, stabbing pain. Today, the pain was softer, like a bruise that was finally healing. He realized that by almost dying, he had learned how to live with their loss. He didn't need to run from the memories anymore. He could carry them with him gently, like stones in his pocket that were smooth from years of being touched. Later that week, he met a close friend for lunch at a small, unassuming diner. They chose a booth in the back, away from the windows. His friend looked at him over the menu, searching for signs of the old Keanu. "You look lighter," his friend said, pouring coffee. Keanu smiled. It was a genuine expression, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "I feel lighter," he said. "I feel like I put down a bag I've been carrying for 20 miles. "Are you going back to work soon?" his friend asked cautiously. "I heard they want to restart production in a month." Keanu stirred his coffee, watching the dark liquid swirl. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe, but not yet. I need to learn how to walk before I can run again. In every way." They talk about other things, music, books, a funny thing the friend's cat had done. It was a normal conversation between two friends. When the food came, Keanu ate slowly, savoring the taste. He wasn't eating just to fuel his body for a stunt. He was eating for the pleasure of it. He laughed at a joke his friend made, a deep, resonant sound that surprised even him. It felt good to laugh without forcing it. As they finished their meal and stepped out of the diner, the street was busy with the lunch rush. People were rushing back to offices, talking on phones, their minds a million miles away. Keanu stood on the sidewalk, taking a moment to just breathe. The city was loud and chaotic, but he was the stillness in the center of it. He said goodbye to his friend and turned to walk home. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long, golden shadows across the pavement. He walked at his own pace. A young guy recognized him and did a double take, raising a phone to take a picture. Keanu didn't shrink away or put his head down. He simply looked at the guy, offered a small, peaceful nod, and kept walking. He didn't have the energy to perform, but he didn't have the fear anymore either. He was just a man walking down the street. He reached his house and walked up the path. He paused before opening the front door. He looked up at the sky, watching the first stars begin to prick the darkening blue. He thought about the battle he had fought. It had been fought in hospital rooms and therapy gyms, in the quiet moments of the night when he thought his heart would give out. He had fought not for fame or money, but for the chance to experience this exact moment. The fight for recovery wasn't about becoming a superhero again. It was about accepting that he wasn't one. It was about embracing the fragility of being human. He realized that real strength wasn't about never breaking. It was about how you put yourself back together afterward. He had put himself back together, but the pieces fit differently now. There were gaps where the grief used to be, gaps that let the light shine through. He opened the door and stepped inside, leaving the noise of the world behind him. He didn't need to run anymore. He didn't need to hide. He was home, not just in the house, but in his own skin. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and for the first time in 30 years, he was completely at peace.